Okay, so now that we've discussed the kind of controls and kind of functionality that we'd like on our arm, let's now jump over into Houdini and begin the implementation of those controls. In this video, I'd like to go ahead and get the bones in the arm created and then the FK controls for them applied. Now, usually this should be a very simple task. We know that we've created that FK controls tool that makes creating FK controls very simple. Setting up bones in the arm is also very simple. However, here we actually have to do something a little bit unusual with the creation of our arm bones. So let's jump over into Houdini and talk a little bit about what that is. So we can see we've got our elbow, and we know that we want our elbow to rotate around what is currently the world Y-axis, such that the lower arm would rotate around the elbow, around what is currently facing directly towards us, and rotate around like so. Now, this would mean, if we had our bones set up in the conventional way, that the world Y-axis as it stands right now for our bones would need to be the X-axis. In other words, we'd need to create the bones from the top view. And that's because we want, if possible, to have our bones rotate on X primarily. All of the bones tools, all of the character setup tools, things like IK and the rotation orders all prefer to have the bones set up with a major rotation on X. However, that's actually going to lead to some issues with a very simple motion, something as simple as rotating our arm in a swinging arm type motion. And that's just because of the fact that we're going to actually run into something called gimbal lock. Now, what we can do is, if we actually set this up so that our orientation is slightly different, if we set it up so that instead of rotating on X at the elbow, we're actually rotating on Y, we don't run into gimbal lock setting up this particular scenario. Now, this does mean that our controls are going to be oriented differently, hence not getting gimbal lock, but our bones are going to be oriented differently also, meaning we're rotating about Y and not about X. In actual fact, it's going to be fine in this case, as long as we're careful with our rest angles, make sure that we tell IK how we want that arm to bend, as long as we're careful when we're creating our bones to make sure that they lie on a plane such that IK and FK can both deal with the bones in a similar fashion, everything will function correctly. Now, you may ask yourself, why can't we just change the rotate order on our FK controls? You know that if we did change the rotate order on the FK controls, yes, we could, by changing the rotate order, avoid the gimbal lock issue that we're running into. The problem with that is, if we change the rotate order on our controls, we'd need to change the rotate order on our bones. We need to have the same rotations between both the control object and the bone applied in the same order. But if we change the rotate order of the bones, then our IK is going to have problems. The IK cannot have a bone that doesn't have the default rotation order for a bone applied. It will generate its rotations incorrectly, basically. So we need to keep our rotate order on the control object, and so to avoid this gimbal lock issue, we are going to need to start with a different orientation. Now, in this video, I'm going to first create the bones in the conventional manner with the rotation at the elbow being on X. Then I'll set up some FK controls on them and take a look at the gimbal lock issues that we will run into in that kind of setup. I'll then turn around, delete all of those, and create the actual arm setup, and we'll create that from the front view so that we're rotating the elbow on the Y-axis local of the bone, and then we can go ahead and get those set up with their FK controls, and that will then wrap up this video. So let's start out, jump into a top view with space 2, I'm going to jump into wireframe, I'm going to create bones from the shoulder to the elbow, and then the lower arm bone from the elbow to the wrist. And I am just going to place these roughly, since we are just doing a test here. So I'm going to grab our bones tool and create from the shoulder to the elbow to the wrist. Let's go ahead, grab the move tool, jump into a perspective view. Let's go ahead and grab the root and jump back up to object mode. There we go, grab the root and translate that up into the shoulder. So we've got our arms roughly. I can now go ahead, hide out the goblin geometry. And let's go ahead and apply our FK controls to those bones. So I'm going to grab the FK controls tool, grab bone 1, enter, and then bone 2, enter. That will create those controls. Let's boost up their geoscale just slightly. Fantastic. So let's say that we wanted to animate our arm in a fairly common motion, and that would be to have the arm move down by our side. So that will currently be a rotation in Y to move the arm down to our side. Then let's go ahead and key that in its current location. Let's move forward a few frames, and let's say that the character rotates his arm back as if he was swinging it backwards, and then was to rotate his arm forwards. And it looks like everything worked correctly. It looks like, based on everything that happened interactively in the view, that everything did work correctly. But look what's going to happen. We're getting some nasty gimbal lock issues. That rotation shouldn't cause gimbal lock on a character. It's a very common rotation, but indeed it is causing gimbal lock. And we can take a look. If we actually look at this in gimbal mode, we can see why we're getting that issue. When we rotated the arm from its start location down to its current position, we have just rotated one of the axes over the other axis. This comes from the fact that we have a rotation order. One rotation is applied, then the next, then the next. So when we're in gimbal mode, by right-clicking on the handle and coming down to gimbal mode, we can see that that first rotation, because it's of 90 degrees, has just eliminated one of our axes of movement. That means that we now don't have an axis of movement for that motion. So that first few frames of motion, we don't have an axis of movement. Now after that point, it sorted itself out, and we do have an axis of motion for that last swing. But that first swing, we do not. We can see that because of that, we're getting some really interesting rotations to take us from this point to that destination point. We can't simply rotate up. We don't have an axis to rotate on to rotate up in that way. So we're going to have to deal with our controls in a different manner, and that's because if we were to rotate on Y, we can see we lose the Z axis, we lose that rotational axis. If we were to have this set up such that this was X and this was Y, you can see when we rotate on X, Y comes along with us. Thus, if this was X and we rotated it down, and X was Y, it would come along for the ride. We'd then have an axis to rotate on. So I'm going to go ahead and delete out those bones and FK controls. And in this case, I want to bring back the visibility of the skeleton, since I want to deal with setting these up as our final bones, so I want to be fairly accurate with their placement. Also, while we're here, let's grab both of the geometry networks and move those down below the rest of our rig so far. So I know that I don't want to create these bones in the top view, I want to create these bones in the front view. So I'm going to push space and 3 to jump into a front view. And I want to create these bones such that they exist in the front view, going from the shoulder to the elbow and down to the wrist. So I'm going to go ahead and grab the bones tool. I have the chain name of L, so that is going to give me L underscore in my names. And let's start this inside the pivot point for the ball joint at the shoulder. So I put the first bone there. I want to bring that up and to the pivot point in the center of the elbow. So something right around here, and then move along and around about where our wrist is, so something around about like so. If we enter to accept that creation, now the bones we have created most likely are going to exist on a very weird plane for our IK to work correctly, but let's go ahead and position these bones using the bone tool, and then we can go ahead and deal with the fact that we know that we only want this lower arm bone to rotate on Y, and because of that we can go ahead and delete any other rotations that we happen to have on that bone. So let's grab our lower arm bone, and I want to move the pivot point back, and if we take a look in shaded view, we can see that we have the ulnar that comes in, and the ulnar's pivot point needs to be right around where the elbow is. So that means that the elbow itself needs to bend from this point. That would be where the lower arm pivots around from the upper arm. I'm then going to jump in and grab this point and move that in somewhere into the wrist, maybe back just slightly. Something right around there should work out fantastically. Fantastic. So we do indeed have that in place. So that's the shoulder, the elbow and the wrist all in place. So now I'm going to jump over, and if we were to take a look at those bones, take a look at the lower arm bone, we can see that we do indeed have some very interesting rotations off of the Y axis there. Basically, I want to make sure that we don't have any interesting orientation issues. So I'm going to go ahead and actually extract the pre-transform for the arm bone, and then make sure that instead of the setup that we currently have, I'm going to delete out the Z rotation and the X rotation. That is going to look like it broke our arm, but indeed what I can do is grab our root and then rotate our root to then match the elbow and wrist location. Much like with the leg, I want to make sure that the plane that is defined by these bones exists with this rotation solely being on the Y. That means that when we have IK is going to drive this such that it will bend the lower arm based on its Y-axis and not give it any other interesting rotations. We need that because we know when we set up our FK controls, we're going to restrict the motion of the FK control to the Y-axis only, and we need to be able to match our FK controls over to the IK. So if IK comes in and does something crazy where it bends the arm up in X, and we know that the arm can't physically do that, but if IK did come in and do that because of the fact that we'd have these existing on some other kind of plane, then the problem that we'd have there is that FK, when we try and match our FK controls to the IK, we wouldn't be able to match those controls. So we do have that rotation there. We can go ahead and clean rotates. That will push that rotation back into our pre-transform, giving us nice clean bones, but now we know that the plane that they define, even though it's very subtle, the plane they define will cause this bone to rotate solely on Y. So now that we've got those in place, let's go ahead and apply FK controls to them. I guess it would make sense first to rename these. So L underscore shoulder root, and we can go ahead, turn off its visibility and selectability. Then L underscore upper arm, and again turn off its selectability, and L underscore lower arm, turn off its selectability. And I do want to go ahead and give these a node color of a deep sort of orangey yellow. And now that we've got those in place, we can go ahead and apply FK controls to them. So I'm going to jump over to our character rigging tab, grab the FK controls tool. Let's grab our upper arm as the start bone and enter, lower arm as the end bone, enter. That will create two FK controls. First thing I want to do is go ahead and give these a blue wireframe color, since we're dealing with controls on our left hand side of the character. So let's give them a blue wireframe color. I also want to boost their geoscale slightly. For the shoulder, let's boost that up probably around somewhere around there. For our elbow, I'll boost it up maybe not quite as much, maybe to something like so. Now we know with our elbow that we need the elbow control to always exist at the elbow. Now currently it does, but it does that using its pre-transform, which is a hard-coded value. We know that we're going to be having stretchy bones. That means this upper arm bone may change length, and that would cause our elbow control to hang around here, even if our lower arm actually attaches to the upper arm down here. So we need to remove the current pre-transform and actually replace that instead with a reference to the bone length. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to unlock the translate, rotate, and scale parameters to make sure they're all unlocked, and I'm going to extract our pre-transform. I want to zero out our translates and change translate in Z to a negative. In this case, I want to reference L underscore upper arm underscore, L underscore upper arm / length. So we are indeed referencing that length to position us correctly. Now if I was to push the rotates back into the pre-transform, we'd have a problem. We'd rotate by, well, that's very close to 0. That's very close to 0, so let's zero those out just to make things a little bit clearer. We'd rotate on Y by a negative 2.5, and then we'd translate in the new local Z. That would mean we'd actually rotate about here and translate out in a very subtle but very slightly different position, and our arm control wouldn't actually exist at the correct pivot point. Now because we're rotating on Y and we're rotating on Y alone, if I was to delete out this 0 and not push that through to the pre-transform, it wouldn't cause any difference in our control. So if I was to delete this out to 0, you'll see that that does indeed cause our control to change, but since we're simply going to be using rotate Y to drive our bone, as opposed to using rotate X and rotate Z that now don't quite align correctly, we're using rotate Y to drive our bone, and that means that we can zero out that parameter and it all will work fine. So in actual fact, we don't need a pre-transform on our lower arm FK control. So I can go ahead and we can lock the translates, lock our scales back, and I want to lock all but rotate Y on the lower arm. I also want to jump over to the MISC tab, and let's make sure that we set our orientation to be the ZX plane, so our circle indicates that we can only rotate on Y. So now with that in place, we have our upper arm control and our lower arm control, giving us the correct rotations that we need. We could now come in and set up again a very basic animation on this control object and see that we no longer fall into that gimbal lock issue. So if I right click and actually show gimbal mode, you can see when we rotate this round to the side of our body, we maintain an axis that we can now rotate on in order to swing our arms. So that's actually not going to give us gimbal lock now. So I can key our rotate parameter, just jump forward a few frames and rotate our arm backwards. Now you can see from there we'd have some issues, but that's fine. This is a much more common motion than having your arm move back and then trying to bring your arm round to the front. Swinging your arm back and forth is a much more common motion, so I'm going to key that. And you can see that only one axis changed. That means that we are indeed rotating truly on an axis. And then finally we can rotate that back down and forwards and key, and again only rotate Y change, because indeed we're rotating truly on the Y axis and not on some variation on an axis based on trying to keep these all mutually perpendicular. We can see that in gimbal mode we're seeing the true axes after rotations are applied in a certain order. So if we were to play that back, our arm now swings without getting that interesting gimbal lock issue that we were hitting originally around here, where our control had to rotate off axis in order to bring our arm up into that position. So that has now fixed the issues we were getting. So I'm going to rewind back to the beginning, delete out any animation on that control, zero that control back to its default location, ensure that control's at its default location. And with that, that is going to conclude the setup of the FK controls on our arms. Thanks a lot.